It's a mission to Mars. No boys allowed. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, I practically did this entire episode just for you.
Thank you.
I read a story recently, and this is breaking news from the 1950s, but apparently there has been substantial research done that indicates that for long space journeys, such as a journey to Mars, which may take more than 1,000 days, that we would be wise, at least in the early trips, to make the entire crew composed solely of women. And it's not because of any kind of, sexist thing or trying to balance the books of history because only men went to the moon or anything like that. It's because of a few basic scientific facts, so-called. An all-female crew on a long journey uses 26% fewer calories, breathes up 29% less oxygen, and uses 18% less water than a male crew. Now, there are some other kind of psychological benefits where, maybe it's less likely that there'll be a gunfight over a long journey among women than there would be among men. But primarily, these scientists who have done this study have said on a 1,080-day mission, you would need 1,695 fewer kilograms of food, or roughly 10% of the payload of a Falcon Heavy. Bill, on the basis of science, are you willing to accept the premise that the first voyagers on the Starship, the first crew that we send, should be an all-female crew?
Well, I think they'd save a lot more than the calories you listed, because I don't think it'd be more than 2 weeks before they'd all killed each other and there was only one survivor.
I knew you'd like it.
Yeah. So I just want to be clear on this because it's really an important point. My problem with I don't have any problem with female astronauts or any other kinds of astronauts. I have a problem with diversity hires. And Jordan Peterson has pointed this out, I think, very effectively. He says in a completely free society, it's something like 95% of all bricklayers are going to be male. And in a completely free society, some huge percentage, 80%, are going to be female. So when you say you're going to have an all-woman crew or an all-black crew or an all-whatever crew, you are simply drawing from a shallower pool of talent. That doesn't mean that you can't find good people who do that. I saw the Thunderbirds fly not long ago. One of those pilots was a woman. I couldn't tell which one it was. It's not like she was, bumping into the other airplanes or anything.
Well, they didn't have to parallel park those planes.
Right.
You fly like a girl.
She was as good a pilot as any of the men. But the amount of people to draw upon, if you wanted to do an all-female Thunderbirds, all 6 jets, you would not be picking the best people anymore. You'd be picking the best women now. So what I'm trying to say here is that with consistent standards and a colorblind, sex-blind admission process, you get the best people. And I cannot think of any benefits that would outweigh that principle. And since the vast majority of people involved in STEM, engineering, science, and just the entire idea of exploration is pretty much a male thing, Our brains are wired differently. They do studies on things like even with little kids. If you put little kids in a room in a circle, the little boys will be looking out around the circle, and generally the little girls are looking inside. Natasha will often say to me, "How did you notice that there was a falcon on that branch 9 miles away?" I said, it's probably the same reason that I can't find the ketchup in the refrigerator, even though I've looked for 5 hours. And then it's right in front of your eyes, man. So there are differences biologically. And when you're dealing with something on that level, you have to pick the best individuals for the job. I have seen plenty of evidence to suggest that there is that women or any other type of special interest group you want to name are capable of achieving those standards. It's just, so yes, you get great players. They just don't have as deep a bench, Scott. And so when you start making statements like it should be all women, you get into troubles. And I'll tell you something that I haven't had to experience, but it's given me a great deal of something to think about. When they began to when they began to admit women into naval ships, at sea warships, aircraft carriers, and so on. Submarines were the last to go. I thought to myself, I could see how that could change the entire dynamic of the crew. If I'm on a submarine full of 100 guys, and we've got 100 guys, then we're 100 guys, and we're 100 guys without any women, and there aren't any women, so we think about what we're going to do at shore leave and all the rest. This is me speculating. I'm not on the sub. If I was on a sub with 90 guys and 10 women, I think a significant amount of my time would be dedicated to how can I get to be the boyfriend of one of these 10 women, and a significant amount of jealousy and resentment if I wasn't. And I think these things are much more powerful than what studies might suggest about,
So are you saying not only should it not be an all-female crew, it should be an all-male crew to go to Mars?
It would depend on the degree of isolation. You could probably make a pretty good case for sending married couples. But on that first mission, I would just send the best people we have. And the best people we have are people like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, who, when they were preparing to lift off from the moon, they'd done their moonwalk and brought their samples on board. And turns out that somebody had swung one of these bags of rocks around, and they had smashed the button that you have to push to get the lunar module off the ascent stage of the lunar module, get back to orbit. They cannot launch this thing because the button's broken. I want people who, this famous story is interviewed Buzz Aldrin, a woman reporter interviewed him and said, so were you thinking about what your final message to Earth would be? Were you composing like a kind of message for your family? And Buzz looked at her like she was from, I almost said Mars, but Venus, and said, no, we were trying to figure out how to fix the switch. Turned out a ballpoint pen was perfect. And that's how they launched off the surface of the moon. So if you have that kind of attitude, that is an engineering attitude. Men's brains, this is just a proven fact, men's brains are much better at processing 3D imagery of the world. We can rotate things in our head, and men are generally able to read maps much better than women. Women, on the other hand, are far better at detecting nuances of emotion, and all of this stuff makes biological sense. So I'm saying, if you've got steely-eyed missile women, put them on board. But the idea of just women is, to me, nuts.
Well, Steve, let's accept Bill's argument at face value and say that men are better at those kinds of tasks. We're in a significantly different age than we were when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were out there with Michael Conrad. And I think that people... Collins, I'm sorry. A lot of these ships are now really... It's not so much that we need fighter pilots. We need people who can carry on good human relations for long periods of time, because a lot of the flying stuff can be done remotely, or at least pre-programmed into the computer so that it's doing what it needs to do. Not to say that we don't have any STEM requirements, but Bill's already established that there are enough women out there. Obviously, since Barbie has gotten on the task, we have enough women going into STEM. So why not send the most fuel-efficient, food-efficient, oxygen-efficient crew we can on that first mission to Mars? And we can always follow up with men later, but why not take advantage of the extra space that we're saving to have other kinds of equipment in there that we need to establish a base, for example?
Well, I'm just going to say that once we've got enough heavy lift to get to Mars in a sizable way. I'm not just talking about, leaving some footprints and coming back like we did on Apollo 11. Once we have the lift to get to Mars and establish a presence, about the last thing we're going to worry about is that kind of mass. We've got much bigger concerns on how we're going to on what we're going to take with us. I think this is just back of the envelope math here, but I don't think cruise stores are going to be the deciding factor on what we're going to put in these spaceships. And it's going to take more than one spaceship, by the way. It doesn't matter how big the SpaceX Starship is. The reason why Musk needs to build so many of them is it's going to take, 10,000 trips to Mars. So he's going to need at least 1,000 of these spaceships going back and forth all the time. So the crew composition, all male, all female, I don't think that's don't think the mass of their supplies is in any way a deciding factor. Bill covered some interesting ground that I want to go back over. The idea that male crews are going to be shooting at each other, I think, is largely BS. You look at onboard submarines. You look at onboard most sailing ships going around
throughout all of history.
Yeah, going around in the 15th, 16th century into unknown worlds, unknown oceans. For the most part, those went very, very well. Although I did have Bill, you mentioned the Thunderbirds. My wife and I just had this conversation a couple of nights ago, and I can't remember how it came up. But when it comes to being fighter pilots, men tend to be much better at single-focus tasks and at solving problems in 3D space.
3D.
Yes, and women tend to be better at multitasking, and that struck a memory chord in the development of the F-35, the Lightning II. What's one of the remarkable things about that plane isn't that it's stealthy, although it's very nice to be harder to find when people are trying to shoot at you. But if you've ever seen an AWACS plane, that's airborne warning and control system, the big jumbo jet with a big radar dome on top. And there's got a crew of guys sitting in front of TVs plotting out air battles and all the rest. Each F-35 with one guy in there, or one gal, is essentially an entire AWACS crew. And one of the things they spent the longest time, and I don't think they've got all the kinks worked out of it yet, is the software to reduce what they call the cognitive load on the pilot, because this plane is capable of so many things, and it's not a two-seater. You got one pilot in there doing all of it. How do you reduce through software the cognitive load on the pilot? And it makes me wonder if the realm of fighter pilots hasn't moved away from this idea of being able to do one task really well in 3D space and becoming more of a multitasker. So we might be moving into a time where women could conceivably become by their nature, the more likely fighter pilots than men, a complete role reversal. I don't know if this is true. It was just one of those things that occurred to me to wonder aloud about in a conversation with my wife. And, of course, she, being an Air Force brat, was very pleased with the idea of having a fleet of female F-35 pilots. That said, in this day and age, it is probably impossible to say we're going to have an all-male crew for this first trip to Mars if the government is having anything at all to do with it. On the other hand, we've got to be very, very careful about how we do pick a mixed crew. There's a book I've read many times that begins with a famous line, "Once upon a time there was a Martian named Michael Valentine Smith." And it's Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. And the first trip to Mars, as described in this book, was four married couples who had been very carefully selected for their combination of being able to get along with each other, to be able to get along with the other couples, and to have all the correct skills. Pilot, navigator, astrogator, cook, doctor, everything you could possibly need out of 8 people on this very long 2 or 3 year mission. And, of course, the mission ends in disaster on the surface of Mars with affairs, an illegitimate birth, and murder. So, the second trip to Mars had a much faster engine. It lasted about 6 months, and it was an all-male military crew. And that may be the way to go. If it's got to be a government thing and it's not SpaceX, make it a military crew. Men are pretty good at working in hierarchical structures. It's I don't know if it's the way we're wired, the way we're trained, or both. But if it's a short enough mission, God, maybe do it the old way. But that being politically impossible, we better be very careful about how we pick that mixed crew.
Since this is my episode directed at me specifically and custom tailored for my personal responses, let me just add just 2 things to this. One of the reasons that seems to be left out of this remarkable study is that saying that women consume fewer calories is they consume fewer calories because they're not as big as men are and they're not as strong as men are. And there are often times when you need physical strength, especially in an emergency, and that could make the difference between life and death. So there's that aspect of it. The only other thing I want to say about you mentioned, we've got software to take care of that now. we had a switch built into the LEM. It wasn't like it wasn't there. What you're really dealing with is how fast can you think on your feet in an emergency and apply a Band-Aid situation to get you out of there. But final thing is the primary characteristic of an excellent sub-commander is patience, and the primary characteristic of a fighter pilot is aggression. It's got nothing to do with their multitasking or whatever. If you are either engaged defensive or engaged offensive, and it is sheer aggression. I'm not saying there aren't women who can do that, but I am saying that when it comes down to physical, violent aggression, we pretty much got the clubhouse on that one. So again, you can find candidates for all of these things, and they are superb. They're as good as the men. But if you want to deal with how we're wired, it wouldn't be my first choice.
Well, my instinct when I first read this story was, well, that's fascinating. First of all, I just didn't realize that women didn't consume as many calories, breathe as much oxygen, use as much water, and all that kind of stuff. So just from a scientific perspective, I thought that was fascinating. However, I do think that the general approach from the various scientists who have studied this and the writer who put the story together is kind of a limited pie view of life. It's the idea that we need to have the bare minimum consumption of anything on this trip to Mars because we're barely going to be able to get there by the skin of our teeth, and we got to conserve every aspect. Now, we do have to conserve weight, and we have to conserve resources and stuff like that. And certainly when I read the story of the lunar rover program, the shaving of ounces of weight off of those things and trying to make sure they still had structural integrity was just amazing. However, I also know that just by our nature, when we go to Mars, we're going to take twice as much stuff as we need for 2 crews if we only have 1 crew. And that we don't have a limited pie view of life. We have the Mars or bust attitude view of life, which is we're getting there. And so, we're not going there to attack it. We're going to go there to live there. And so we will plan as if everything could go wrong and we would still get there and everybody would be alive. And we'll make those kinds of evaluations along the way. So I think it's really a false dichotomy. Do we need to make it all women? Do we need to make it all men? I think we need a combination of women and men because of the various giftedness, abilities in general of those people. However, I get to meet a lot of people every day who are trying to decorate their houses. And a lot of times it's the guy who cares much more about it and knows more about it, but it's usually the women. So you can find men who have gifts that are more primarily like you would expect from the general populace of women and vice versa. We don't really have to worry about that. Like Bill said, it's more of a meritocracy thing. It's who brings the various skills and abilities that we need for this long-term mission, who has demonstrated the ability to work together, to be able to function in a crisis, to be able to step into leadership when necessary, to be able to handle when things go all awry. And you'll find men and women in equal measure who all have the abilities to do those kinds of things in various ways. So I think what's amazing to me about all of this is that I am alive in a time when we're talking about who we're sending to Mars. Yes. It's not a matter of, someday maybe we'll go to Mars. Like at this point, if the Lord should keep me around just a little bit longer, I'm going to see it. I'm going to see video shot by humans from the surface of Mars. I'm going to see Instagram selfies that are taken. And it's like, hey, look, we found that little helicopter thing we sent up here a couple of years ago. I'm taking a picture with it. And that we will get to experience this. And I just think it's awesome that these kind of conversations go on, that we get a chance to be part of an age like this when these things are not only possible, but are happening. And if Elon Musk can figure out a way to launch that Starship without blowing up the entire Earth underneath him next time, then I think we're getting much closer than we realize. And I can't wait. I will savor every moment of it. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.